The general benefits of physical activity are of course well known, but the more specific benefits for learning languages are often overlooked. So let's have a look at 6 benefits of learning Chinese through sports and other physical activities. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about sports and physical activities and how they can help you learn Chinese. Throughout my journey to learn Chinese, I've used sports to boost my learning many times. I've played badminton, football and volleyball with native speakers. I have practiced gymnastics and diving entirely in Chinese, and I've even taken 1 semester of physical education at a university in Taiwan. Like I said in the intro, I think most people are aware that physical activity is good for them, so I will not focus on those aspects here, but instead try to discuss more how physical activity can boost your Chinese learning in particular. I think sports and physical activities in general are sometimes viewed as opposed to academic success, so that means you're either good at sports or academic subjects, but not both. And if you focus on one, you will fall behind with the other. This might be true if you're a professional football player or if you are preparing for an extremely important exam, let's say the Chinese University Entrance Exam, Gaokao. But for most people, this is a false dichotomy. Instead, the relationship between physical activity and learning more abstract things, including languages such as Chinese, is actually positive, so physical activity can boost your ability to learn a language, which is what we're going to talk about today. Some of the benefits that I will mention will mostly be available for people who live in a Chinese-speaking environment, so if you're in your home country, this might be hard to replicate, but I will also mention several benefits that you can make use of regardless of where you live. So I'm going to go through 6 benefits of using sports and other physical activities to learn Chinese, and then after that we will discuss 3 specific topics in more detail. So benefit number 1 is long-term benefits on physical and mental health. And like I said, I'm not going to go through the research of how this benefits your life in general, how it improves your life expectancy and so on. We all know these things, or at least they are not hard to look up. But I still think it's worth noting that if you are healthy in general, you will have more energy over to spend on Chinese. It's also worth noting that physical activity is beneficial not just for your physical health, but that it also has a positive impact on your cognitive abilities. For example, if you exercise regularly, you probably have a better attention span and you're better at concentrating than if you don't. And this is, of course, significant for learning languages because paying attention and generally concentrating on what you're doing is definitely linked to success when learning Chinese. Still, I don't want to dwell on these general benefits too much, so let's move on to benefit number 2, which is learning languages while moving. So there is some research to suggest that moving around while learning something makes it stick better in your memory. So in one study from Schmidt, Casso et al. From 2014, they had subjects memorize vocabulary while on a treadmill, and this was beneficial compared to subjects who didn't move while they were memorizing the words. This is not too strange from an evolutionary perspective because, of course, our brains evolved in an environment where moving usually involved new things, and when there was something you needed to learn, it typically was something that happened while you moved. Of course, these days we learn lots of things and we encounter many new things while sitting still in front of our computers or using our phones, but this is, of course, a very recent phenomenon. This was just an example, of course. There are other studies that show that even short bursts of physical activity can help subsequent learning. And if you want to look any of these articles up or just get suggestions for further reading, I suggest you head over to the article on Hacking Chinese, and there's a link in the description of this episode, and there is a list at the bottom of the page. Moving on to benefit number 3, and now we're homing in on language learning in particular, and this is comprehensible and embedded communication. So it's abundantly clear that in order to learn a language, we need a ton of meaningful input. When we practice sports or when doing other physical activities, the language that is used in these activities is embedded in a meaningful context. For example, you can hear or see what someone is doing and then associate that with the language that they are using. There's a direct physical reference for much of the language that is used, and that is, of course, great scaffolding for your understanding of that language. This is not only true for input, of course, it's true for output and communication in general, because when you need to say something in, say, a team sport, it is very important and perhaps also urgent that you get it right. And this is a very authentic and genuine type of communication that is often sadly lacking in many classrooms. This benefit is not unique to sports. We have actually talked about it earlier on the podcast when I talked about the benefits of using games to learn Chinese. And sports can be seen as a subset of games, and so it's not surprising that they share certain benefits. If you want to listen to the episode about using games to learn Chinese, that was episode 105, and I'll also put a link to the article in the description of this episode. Moving on to benefit number 4, which is that sports and physical activities are fun, interesting, and motivating. Naturally, this is based on the assumption that you find an activity or a sport that you actually enjoy, and this might be easy or hard depending on what you like and where you live. Personally, I have been very lucky in this regard because I've been able to practice many sports that I love in a Chinese-speaking environment, some of which I mentioned at the beginning of the episode. By far the most important one is gymnastics though, which I practiced for at least a dozen hours every week throughout my graduate studies in Taiwan. Remember though that I'm not talking about sports in particular here, I also include physical activities of other kinds. Maybe it's dancing, maybe it's just something you do in class or when you're studying to break up the monotony and to avoid sitting still for too long. And these activities can also be fun and motivating. Let's continue to the 5th benefit, which is the most important one in my opinion, and that is making friends and expanding social life. How important this is depends a little bit on who you are, but for me, who regard myself as a somewhat introverted student, I'm not going to make many friends just by going about my everyday life, and I'm not going to strike up conversations with strangers and so on. I need a good excuse or a good opportunity to talk with other people, and practicing a sport is a very good way of doing this. As you get to know the people you practice and play with, you will also hang out with them in other situations, maybe after practicing and maybe just in your spare time. They might also introduce you to their friends and other social contexts that you wouldn't have access to if you didn't share a common sport. While the social aspects of sports are slightly easier to notice when it comes to team sports as opposed to individual sports, these benefits are certainly not limited to team sports, and I will get back to that in a minute. Let's continue with benefit number 6, which is culturally significant sports and physical activities. So let's not forget that you can learn much about Chinese language and culture by focusing on activities that have a cultural significance in the Chinese-speaking world. An obvious example of this would be practicing something like Taiji Quan or Tai Chi, which you will know is one of the reasons I started learning Chinese in the first place, which I talked about in episode 128. Naturally, the sport or activity here doesn't have to be something that has a long history and that is intimately connected with Chinese philosophy and things like that. It could equally well be activities that are simply popular in China, such as table tennis or even joining in the local Chinese square dancing or guangchangwu. Okay, so now that we have gone through the 6 major benefits of using sports to learn Chinese, I want to dig a little bit deeper in a few of these areas. First, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the social aspects of practicing sports in Chinese. Then I will talk about a teaching method called total physical response. And then finally, I will also talk about how to implement physical activities in your learning routine, or if you're a teacher, in your teaching routine. So let's start with the social aspects. We all know that the more you engage with Chinese, the more you will learn. And this means that you should take any opportunity you can to fill your life with Chinese, which does include your social life. One of the most powerful forms of motivation, it's what's usually called integrative motivation, and that is the desire to fit in and be understood in a social context. This could be with a partner or a loved one, or it could be with friends, classmates, or colleagues. But it could also be with people who play or practice sports with you. As I mentioned earlier, this is not limited to team sports. If I say that I learned Chinese by playing basketball, I think few people would be surprised. I mean, you do indeed need to speak Chinese while playing, you need to communicate in the team, and so on. But if I were to say that my Mandarin improved a lot because I joined the university swimming team, this would probably be met by more frowns. I competed in swimming for almost 10 years, so I'm very familiar with the sport, although this was, of course, before I started learning Chinese. When you practice swimming, you spend most of your time with your ears below water, so barring some kind of bone-conducting earphones that most people haven't heard of anyway, you're not going to learn much Chinese while crawling. But that is not the point. The point is that most interactions with other people take place outside of the swimming pool, basket court, or gymnastics gym anyway. It doesn't really matter what the sport is. I mean, yes, it's true that people communicate more when playing basketball compared to when swimming, but this communication is extremely limited compared to ordinary social interactions anyway, and it doesn't matter all that much. So if most of the communication is not related to the sport itself, well, it follows that it doesn't matter if you're practicing basketball or swimming, you will reap the same benefits anyway. My gymnastics practice in graduate school in Taiwan is a good example of this. Of course, I talked to the coach, I talked to my teammates and so on while we practiced, but most of the time you're practicing, you're not talking to anybody. But then we spent lots of time together before practice, we chatted when we had breaks during practice, and afterwards we also usually had dinner together. Then, as you get to know the people you're practicing or playing with, you will also, like I said earlier, engage with them in other areas that aren't related to the sport itself. Maybe they will invite you to a social event, or you will go shopping together. It doesn't really matter. Even though I do think that the social aspect is perhaps the most important one, there are reasons to believe that physical activity can aid language learning more directly. As mentioned earlier, language usage in sports and other physical activities is usually embedded in a meaningful context, usually with clear references to, say, objects or motions. Naturally, you don't need a sport to do this, you can do that with basic movements that actually work very well in a normal classroom. And the best teaching method that is based on this idea is Total Physical Response, TPR, which was developed by James Asher in the 1960s and 70s, and then onwards by him and other people. In this method, the teacher first models physical actions and links them to spoken language. So, for example, the teacher might say stand up while performing that motion, and then say sit and then sit down. So now the students have two words or two phrases, and they have two actions linked to them. And then the teacher will issue these instructions to the students, and they are supposed to follow. And then after a while, as the students become more confident, they can give the teacher or each other instructions as well. This might sound very limited at first, but you can actually cover a wide range of language this way. For example, you can include something like if clauses in your instructions and say something like, if you wear red, raise your left hand, and if you wear green, raise your right hand. And now you have fairly complex language here, but it's still linked to physical responses of some kind. If you take this one step further, you can also see that instructions from a sports coach can actually be viewed as a form of total physical response. The coach might notice something you're doing which isn't right or that could be improved, and then instructs you in Chinese how to fix this. Maybe they can model it by showing you what it's supposed to be like, or they can otherwise point out where the problem is. This should make it clear that TPR, even though it is often associated with younger learners, it works very well with adults too. And I've used this method when teaching beginner students at university many times, and I think it usually turns out quite well. To give you a concrete example, I once told some of the students to leave the room, and then I, together with the remaining students, built a maze out of desks and chairs. And this was right after they had learned about directions in Chinese. They could say back, forward, left, right, stop, things like that. And so this activity was meant to practice this and also make them move around a bit. After we had constructed the maze, we called in one of the students and blindfolded them, or maybe they just closed their eyes, I don't really remember. But anyway, their classmates were then supposed to guide them through the maze using only Chinese. And they could only say things like take a step forward, stop, turn right, one step forward, things like that. And this was great fun, they all enjoyed it immensely, and they had ample opportunity to use Chinese embedded in a meaningful context. So the last thing I want to talk about is how to incorporate physical activity into your learning routine, or like I said earlier, if you're a teacher, into your teaching routine. As I often talk about here on Hacking Chinese, if you want to learn as much as possible, you need to find ways of diversifying your learning. There's a clear parallel here with listening practice, where it's important that you have listening material available on different levels. If you feel up to it and you have lots of energy, maybe it's a great idea to listen to something a little bit more challenging that you find very interesting. But if you have less energy and feel a bit tired, obviously you should focus on things that are easier. And if you're really tired and don't feel like studying at all, maybe just put on some Chinese music. The principle here is that it's always better to do something rather than nothing. Similarly, I think when it comes to physical activities and sports and learning Chinese, I think you should keep reading and listening the normal way, so to speak. You don't need to embed all your learning inside of sports or physical activities, but you should have these methods as a backup when you feel tired, when you feel you should move around a bit anyway, and just as a general boost to insert throughout the day when you feel a little bit tired. This is particularly important if you're studying Chinese a lot and you are near full time, for example, because then mixing things up is extremely important because there's simply no way you can spend, say, 8 hours a day reading and listening without moving around or without doing anything else. So incorporating physical activities into your learning routine will also mean that you can spend more time on the other things because you will have more energy and your brain will be more active. So in order to conclude this episode, I'd like to give some advice for students and then some advice for teachers. So if you're a student, you should explore ways you can make use of the benefits that I've discussed in this episode. If possible, you should try to find native speakers to practice sports with. That's a great way of learning, as I've said many times. But if that is not possible, maybe you can still find some other way of leveraging the benefits we have discussed here. For example, there is no reason to sit still while you're listening. You can move around, maybe take a walk. And make a point of not sitting still for too long and try to find various activities to mix things up a bit. If you are a teacher, you should check out Total Physical Response. If you're like me, maybe you heard about this method in your teacher education, but didn't take it too seriously. I think it's well worth looking into, and you should definitely take it seriously. And this is true regardless of if you are teaching younger kids. It's great for that, but it's also true if you are teaching adults. I also strongly recommend that you check out an article called Playing to Learn, a review of physical games in second language acquisition by Tomlinson and Masuhara, 2009. And like for the other articles I've mentioned, there is a complete list of references in the written version of this episode on Hacking Chinese. So the bottom line is that physical activities and sports can be very useful for learning Chinese, but this is often overlooked, especially by adult students. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.